love that song. That's an awesome song. I still gotta find where I gotta find the site where you had that made up. I definitely want to get one of those made up.
Suno.com.
What's it called?
SUNO.
SUNO. Okay. Suno.com. All right, I'm going there. This is gonna be a lot of fun. Oh, I have seen this.
I have way too much fun with that.
Drinking beer, laughing like fools on the street, claiming laws don't apply, 10 hats and neat. You shout and scream, ain't got no clue. Conspiracies and chaos made the town blue. Watching from the bar, we chuckle and cheer. Bartending outside with another cold beer, pretending they rule, acting like kings. Forgotten reality wrapped up in wings on the nonsense. Y'all making us grin. Bars through the loft.
Does it write the music or just put the put the lyrics together? Or
I put the synopsis in and the style of music and then generate.
Nice. Well, welcome everybody. It's Jodi Day. Happy Jodi Day, Nick and Dave. Even though that's, by the way, you guys can you cannot super chat me, so give me all the likes.
Yeah.
You know,
I'm perfectly happy with the super chats. I mean, go over to Dave, give him the likes and everything until he gets his Patreon up. Then you can.
I work on props. That's what it is. That's all I'm here for.
Thank you. May the Force Lingus be with you. Happy Jodi Day, Nick and Dave. Thank you for your super chat and happy Jodi Day to you too. Yeah, we are at day 54. And I think we have, what's his face? Dr. Robert Gauffner on the stand. And he has been asked about what are the requisites for calling yourself this and that, and trying to undermine the prosecutions. Forensic psychologist.
This is actually a way better witness than the first two witnesses, the expert witnesses that the defense called. And I'm not sure why they didn't just stick with this guy, but he probably didn't actually sit and talk with Jodi and hasn't.
Or he did. And they
did, yeah, they didn't like his opinion. Yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, she's nuts, but not that nuts. Yeah, that's very true as well. That's probably more accurate. Like, well, we'll just use you for the foundational stuff.
Yeah. So that is what we're up to, and day 54 was a full day. The entire. It's over 7 hours, so we have some. We do have this in front of us for a few days.
Yes, Mads, thank you. Yeah. Oh, wait. So this guy's on the stand for a few days.
No, this is the entire day.
Oh, okay. All right.
7 hours with.
For a few streams, you mean? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We will have him on, or I don't know when he's finished, but after him it's Dr. Jill Hayes, presumably also a rebuttal witness for the defense.
Nice. I'll just say hi to everybody in chat. Zach, I see you. He pledges $6 million. Hey, Stray. Stray's been a stranger lately, but it's good to see you. Old Line Red, welcome. Old Line Red.
Well,
Salvador's in the chat. Ghosterly.
Yeah.
Gwendolyn, all you guys. Oh, Jessica Lynn made it. But cool. Welcome, everybody. And if you are new, this is Jodi Arias. She is on trial back in 2013 for the unaliving of her boyfriend, Travis. She did so while he was naked in the shower, and she took pictures of it. And this was right after they decided to take naked pictures of each other, and all of it entered into the court, as well as some sexy mixing and some recorded phone calls of a personal kind and all kinds of good stuff. So we've been having a lot of fun with this trial. She has pled self-defense, claiming that Travis was violent towards her, and the evidence really doesn't seem to be panning out. We are now currently on the defense rebuttal case. So the state went, the defense went, The state went with the rebuttal witnesses. Now the defense is going with their rebuttal witnesses. And we have a doctor trying to explain why the state's experts are all not qualified. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
So there's a summary. There's the beautiful and irreplaceable Jodi Arias. Oh, wait, you can't see her legs. I have her legs right there on the wall.
Yeah, I also have a painting.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, but I still haven't framed it. I'm so sorry to the person who gifted me this about a year ago.
Yeah, I brought it to you in September, sir.
So I do have.
This is my shrine to Jodi, by the way, with the Kuchikopi and the I got to turn the lights on. Hang on. This is Jodi.
Yeah,
so there we got my shrine to Jodi going.
I also have it.
Where's Jodi's back? Who has Jodi's back? Do you have Jodi's
legs? So where's her back?
Yeah, the legs are the best part. Wish she had Bronca on her side. Yeah, Bronca could have made a self-defense claim.
Yeah. Jodi's legs are the best bits if you read between the lines.
Oh, who said that? That was brilliant. Was that you or was that in chat? Nice. Oh, Salvador has her back. That's right. Salvador has her back. Yeah, yep. On his wall. Jodi's back is on Sal's wall. All right.
All right. Let's keep listening to what the good doctor has to say.
And okay, so let's talk about testing for a moment.
Yes, ma'am.
What kind of training or what kind of experience do you have with these types of tests?
A variety. In graduate school, we're trained in some of the tests. I mean, that was a long time ago. I obviously wasn't trained in the trauma symptom inventory because it wasn't in existence when I was in graduate school. But and it was the MMPI 1, not the 2. So part of it is trained in graduate school to do testing. Then part of the practice after that continues that. One of my areas of specialization was diagnostic assessment. So I had quite a bit of and continuing education, and still do, in different types of assessments. When I was in Texas after my doctorate, I became an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Tyler, and then I moved up over the years to full professor.
And let me stop you. In Texas, this is before California, right? This is before where you are now.
Before where I am now, after my doctorate, I took an academic position at the University of Texas at Tyler in 1978. And part of my role in that department was essentially beefing up the assessment. We trained in Texas master's level. So they were licensed as either marriage and family therapists or what's called licensed professional counselors, or actually licensed as psychological associates. These were people at the master's degree. So the program that I was involved in, that was the training we did. So I was actually in charge of expanding our assessment courses and expanding the training that our students received in how to do assessment. So I actually taught the courses from intelligence testing to achievement testing. And then I created in the 1980s the neuropsychological assessment courses and oversaw that. And then I would supervise our graduate students in their what's called internship or practicum training in overseeing the assessments they did. So I did that then, and I still do that. So over the years, we've expanded the assessments. In a clinic that I hadn't talked about, but a clinic I also oversaw, we would test out instruments for different publishers.
What does that mean?
Well, for example, the TSI, the trauma symptom inventory, was developed in the 1980s by a psychologist named John Briere, who's at the University of Southern California. So we were a test site because we were trained in trauma and saw clients who had been traumatized, both offenders and victims. We would often be selected as a site where they could test out their tests. So we would administer them to clients that we saw or people that were involved in research with us, because we've done all those things. So we actually tested out the trauma symptom inventory, gave feedback to the person who was designing it, John, or Dr. Briere, sorry, and then they would make the revisions and test again. So we worked with that instrument before it was public knowledge. And then it actually got published by a professional test publisher. And then we've been using it ever since until they came out with an updated, newer version. So in our current program, we use quite a bit of testing even now when clients come to us. or in forensic cases, and we train. So, for example, last week
Do you have recent experiences at using these instruments as of last week?
Yes.
Okay, what's that?
We do, part of our internship training program is we do trainings each week with all our staff who are the clinical people, the interns, the postdoc. So last week, one of the trainings involved the use of trauma inventories and how do you score it, how do you interpret it. So we're constantly looking at new instruments and what's out there so that the people we're training have the best current knowledge of what we know about how to use different ways of assessing clients, children, adolescents, or adults. So we're continually doing those things.
Okay. And with regard to the testing, are there certain tests that have things that are called validity scales?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second. What is a validity scale in general?
In general, when somebody takes
Approach, please.
All right. I'm not entirely sure what the objection was.
I'm not sure either. This is one of those like secret objections.
Yeah. Probably during the voir dire or of him.
Something.
Yeah, something that was to be excluded because he can't really testify about the tests itself, maybe.
So can you tell us in general about validity scales? What does that mean?
validity scales are ways that tests themselves, some tests build in to check that the person is not trying to distort their responses. So validity scales mean you want to know if the person is being defensive and likely not willing to admit areas of potential problems, or are they lying? Are they actually trying to distort and give you incorrect responses, or are they trying to look good or look bad on the test? So a lot of the instruments build in scales to
Gauffner is here with the information. Seems like Dr. Robert Gauffner had his license revoked recently for APA ethics violations. That's interesting.
Well, doesn't have anything to do with this case.
Nope.
Maybe. Unless he was like, let me go back one more time and talk with this Jodi. Things got out of hand. You never know.
test that out, because in order to interpret a test, you need to know that is it likely that this person answered in a relatively open and honest manner. If they did not, if they were so defensive and not willing to admit anything, or they were trying to lie on this, then it invalidates the test. You don't interpret the test. You basically say the test isn't meaningful because I can't tell what the person was doing. So a lot of the tests now build in scales specifically to look for those things, and then after you determine that the test is valid, you can then interpret the various scales.
And how do these scales work? How can they tell if somebody is being defensive or lying about something?
Well, in general, without giving you information about the specific question.
Sorry.
It just sounded like a pre-planned question. It was like, and how do we do this? Like it's on a children's television show.
Yeah.
It's just a weird way to say it.
One way is by you, in a long test, may have the same type of question asked different ways. And you look at whether the person at the beginning answered the questions the same they did at the end. There are certain things we know in psychology that tend to go together. So you might ask a person about some aspect of themselves and then ask them about another aspect. And we know in the research that those things should have the same answers. So that tells me if somebody's not willing to admit. So these scales actually look at a variety of ways to try to determine if the person is being relatively open and honest in responding to the test.
So is it then, so it doesn't sound as simple as just answering a true or false and lying true or false and you just accepting the answers?
That is correct. It would not be a simple, especially with long tests, like one that has 567 questions. There's virtually no way a person could remember what they answered specifically about a question if they made it up and something similar, an hour later in the test. So that's one of the ways it checks. Even on shorter tests, there are things that the research will show you that are very unlikely. So a person in a variety of settings or with a variety of symptoms, they're not likely to answer a particular question in a particular way. If they do, in my view, it's a red flag. It would escalate or elevate that validity scale, and it would tell the interpreter to be cautious when you're interpreting this result.
All right. And with regard to this case, did you review 2 trauma symptom inventory tests that Ms. Arias did?
Yes, I did.
And did you review a Milan MCMI test?
Yes.
And did you review an MMPI-2 test?
Yes.
And these tests were given by how many different providers? How many different people?
3 different mental health professionals.
And over what period of time? Do you know?
Over about a 2-year period.
Okay. And over that 2-year period, in all of these tests, do these particular tests have validity scales?
Those particular tests do, yes.
Okay. And in that 2-year time, with 3 different mental health professionals giving those tests to Ms. Arias, what did the validity scales tell us about her?
All those tests that had validity scales indicated that they were valid responses. In other words, 2 of the tests indicated no attempt at distortion, lying, or faking good or bad. 1 test indicated significant symptomatology. It didn't invalidate the test, but it indicated that the person was responding in a way that indicated lots of emotional and mental health issues. Another test indicated that at times
Sustained.
You can tell us which test you're referring to.
So the trauma symptom inventories, both versions.
Sustained.
He's about to tell us. You reviewed 2 trauma symptom inventories, right?
Correct.
Okay. Are you speaking generally about the trauma TSI?
I was speaking about both of them. I was about to.
Okay. Go ahead.
Both trauma symptom inventories indicated that the validity scales were in the normal range. There were 3 scales on each test, and they were all within the normal range. The Milan, which is a personality type inventory, indicated that the tests were valid, but the person sometimes was answering in what they would call it in our language socially desirable ways. In other words, it was a little bit elevated in trying to make themselves look actually a little bit less problematic than they might be. The MMPI actually indicated.
So he's claiming that she's malingering, meaning lying or falsifying things on the test, but in a way to minimize her craziness. Is that what I just heard?
Yeah.
Okay, so all right. I just want to make sure that that's what I heard, because that seems okay. I mean, we've never heard that before, right? I mean, we didn't even hear that from the prior her prior witnesses. So if her prior witnesses are saying, yeah, everything she reported is fine, you know, as far as her reporting ability, we didn't sense any malingering or lying, and she's definitely suffering from PTSD as a result of what Travis did to her, blah 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 blah. And now he's saying that she might be malingering, but in favor of not having PTSD, and that's why the state's witness, who said these are not signs of PTSD or any sort of trauma, would be correct, but because she tried to minimize that, I think is what he's trying to say. I just want to make sure I'm kind of summarizing this in my head.
That the person may be responding in a way that they might look a little bit more negative than they are. So all those were in the valid range, all within the normal range, but there's slight differences over the 2 years with the different tests.
And in any of those tests, is there any indication of her defensiveness, being defensive about answering?
There is a scale on the MMPI and on the others. Those were in the normal range on at both tests, the MMPI and the MCMI.
Okay. And with regard to, you're familiar with the MMPI being given by MMPI-2 being given by Dr. DeMarte, right?
Yes, I am.
And so in that particular validity scale, does it show, can we rely on the results in the MMPI?
The MMPI was considered a valid profile, but it also indicated that the person was reporting numerous symptoms of and issues on that particular instrument.
Does that invalidate it in any way?
No, it just tells you to be aware, essentially. It's like a caution that this person is expressing many symptoms, many issues that need to be explored.
And you said you reviewed 2 trauma symptom inventories, 2 TSI tests, right?
That is correct.
Do you know how far apart they were given from each other? How far apart?
A year and a half.
Okay, and anything with both of those validity scales showed that the tests were valid, is that right?
That is correct.
All right, let's talk first, maybe let's do the MMPI.
Yes, ma'am.
Why don't you tell us what it is?
It stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is the second version. It is probably the most common measure of personality characteristics in the field of mental health and psychology. It's probably the most researched measure around. It's a true-false test. It has 567 questions. It takes anywhere from an hour to an hour and 3/4 for somebody to take it. It requires about a 5th grade reading knowledge ability, and it gives you a lot of information. It's broken into what we call the validity scales, which we just talked about. It also has what's called clinical scales, which are general clinical issues like depression, anxiety, etc. And then it has, well, actually I haven't counted, probably 50 subscales to help explain what the other scales mean. And it helps say a clinical psychologist look for what might be going on with this particular person. In my language, it's like it gives you working hypotheses. When you assess somebody, you want to know what are you dealing with, and you form a hypothesis based on this. So the test by itself, you don't want to use to diagnose somebody, but it would provide information to guide you on what might be important to look for in trying to figure out what's going on with the person. You know, what are the different personality issues? And it breaks into numerous subscales.
Okay, well, let's take a look. I'm showing you Exhibit 631. This is the MMPI-2 that Dr. DeMarte conduct. The computer, is it a computer printout? How do you refer to this? It's computer scored, right?
Yes, well, the particular manufacturer of this test has the copyright, so they're the only ones who can computer score it. And because it has so many scales, you really don't want to do it by hand. I mean, we train our people in-house so they know, but it could take you easily an hour just to score all those scales if you're using templates. So now you can score it with the computer by putting in the person's answers, and then you get a printout. And there's different printouts. This is called the extended score report, which provides us all the scales, and then you can get interpretation reports and others. So this is the test that Dr. DeMarte administered and then is scored by the computer.
And you mentioned copyright. Is that what you're talking about at the bottom of the page?
Yes, Pearson is the company that has the copyright to this test. So it means two things. One is they're the only ones who are allowed to score this by computer, which was major lawsuits 10 years ago because others did it and they could not anymore. The other means somebody in my profession cannot give somebody else who's not a trained professional licensed psychologist copies of the raw data or the questions. So it's, in other words, we're not allowed to release that because then it would defeat the purpose of the test.
How
So,
does it defeat the purpose of the test?
well, if people knew what the exact questions and answers were and how that scores, then you could fake the test, because then I would know, well, I don't want to answer this way or that way. So in all the tests that we're talking about, they all are copyrighted, meaning that we're only allowed to release the information to another licensed psychologist or trained mental health professional, who then is also bound by not releasing it to others, so that the confidentiality of the test itself is not breached. The profiles can be shared, but not the questions or how they actually get scored.
Okay, so what we're about to take a look at then has nothing to do with the raw data then.
That, well, it's the results of it,
Yeah.
but it doesn't tell you the exact questions or things, which is acceptable.
Okay, so in other words, we're not going to see the 567 questions, right?
That is correct.
Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this. We're looking at page 2, the validity and clinical scales. So is this a representation of the validity scales on the left side here?
Yes, that is correct.
And we've discussed that already. So let's take onto the right side. What are we looking at here?
These are what are called the clinical scales, which is the major thing you look for diagnosis. And if you look at, well, I don't know how to do this, like the fifth.
There's a, on the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's like a little arrow.
Yes,
You see, if you touch that,
yes,
it'll give you a little menu that you can use as an arrow if you want to.
it won't break. Okay. All right, now
So
what?
if you see the arrow underneath clear,
Yes.
if you push that, you can use it to point things.
Oh, excellent. Do I move the arrow or I just touch something now?
Well, now just touch something.
Okay, so if you see this line here that says 50 across, that's average on this test. So that's what's called in the normal range. If you look up here, can I touch again?
Uh-huh.
Okay, if you look up here, this is 65. That's what is considered the clinical cutoff. So that means scales or scores above that 65 would be in the clinical range and things that we have to pay attention to. Also, just for diagnostic purposes, if you get things really low, that down here below the other way, it's something to pay attention to also in certain scales. So when you look at this particular test, you can see here and here and here, all these are obviously elevated above 65, and that's what I meant before when I said this test is giving you pretty significant symptomatology. It's indicating there's lots of different areas that this person is having difficulty with. And so you generally pick some of the high scales and then interpret it. But this, when you look at this profile, it means that this person is displaying many symptoms in various areas of personality to explore.
Okay, and just so we all understand, at the bottom here we see T-score. Does that actually give us the numbers?
Yes, it does. These scores down here are what gets plotted up here. So if you see this one I just highlighted, says 53, and if you look up here, that's where the dot is. So each of these scores down here are what ends up with that plot.
Okay, and so tell us then, you told us, so there's a number of elevations on this.
That is correct.
Okay, have you ever heard or know about a term such as called a floating profile?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that is?
Floating profile was a term made up by psychologists a long, long time ago to indicate, well, it depends on who you talk to. They had different definitions. But the overall idea was somebody who had a lot of scales above this 65 or 70, they called it a floating profile. Some said you had 6 scales, some said 7, some said different numbers. But the idea was that there was a lot of scales above the 65 or 70 for the MMPI-1. And then they made and wrote up some articles on what it might mean. One of the more common ones that was written for quite a while, quite a bit of research actually, well, not research, quite a few articles was actually written by a psychologist in Dallas, Robert Gatchell. And he originally wrote and published that this floating profile, lots of scales, was associated in his view, in his practice, with what was called borderline personality disorder. And that was published over, I guess his stuff was probably 8 or 9 years, different articles where he was talking about clinical practice. And then research actually started being done. The people who designed the MMPI, and they have lots of very thick books on how to interpret, never talked about a floating profile, didn't think it was relevant. They never used the term. Even in the books that were published while this was going on, none of the MMPI books refer to anything called a floating profile. So this is really by some of the people who are in clinical practice, giving some of their impressions and some of the things they were associating with this type of profile.
That's what Dr. Gatchell was doing.
And some others, and yes.
Okay.
And then people started actually looking at the research. And so articles started coming out around 2006 who actually studied. In other words, in the research arena, somebody has an idea or a hypothesis, you actually study it. So they actually then administered tests to people who had borderline personality and disorder and were diagnosed with that and others, and they did not find any significant association. So articles began to be published around 2006 that said, you know, the research doesn't support any type of thing called a floating profile in order to predict something else. In fact, they said, according to the research, the MMPI was not good at predicting borderline personality disorder or such things as post-traumatic stress disorder or other things. It was designed, and what it was good for was telling you about the person's personality. And so they basically...
Folks, just so you know...
A lot of tedious stuff. A lot of tedious detail.
This is tedious stuff. And there is a way for you guys to...
Super chat to Skip. Super chat to Skip is coming back.
Super chat to Skip is coming back.
$1 a minute. $1 a minute. Is that
$1
what
a
we did last
minute.
time? Yeah, $1 a minute super chat. You can't super chat me, but you can super chat Nick. So
Yep.
give him all of your money. $1 a minute to skip ahead.
Yeah. You can also use PayPal. That way YouTube
Oh,
doesn't.
you can
Yep.
cash at me. I pledge $50 to Skip. Donations must be
we are not
paid in
Amber Hearding
advance.
this one. We are not Amber Hearding this one.
basically said there is no such thing as a floating profile. And so Dr. Gatchell himself started to focus more on chronic pain people and came out with articles, and his colleagues in about 2008 or so, basically saying that the floating profile really wasn't valid and he wasn't using it. And he realized that it really isn't a floating profile. It was really what he termed a disability profile and seemed to be more associated with chronic pain and things like that. So somebody who's reporting numerous symptoms like you see here might be somebody that's associated with either significant personality issues or symptoms or pain. And then he started focusing on a pain population, which is completely separate. And so that term pretty well disappeared in 2008 as the research made it clear that it wasn't useful. It wasn't substantiated.
So is that a term that you use then?
No. In fact, I've never used that term, never trained on it. I mean, I've heard about it, but it was never really researched, so I didn't pay much attention. But when...
Sustained.
So you said you've never really trained on it. Is that because there was not a lot of actual research supporting it to begin with?
Correct. Oh,
You can answer.
yeah, yes, because there was no substantiation of that, so we never trained others about it. I pretty well never paid attention to it until it came up in this case.
Okay. Now, when you have somebody who has multiple elevated scales, like we see here, is it common to take the top 2 or 3?
When you're doing interpretation, yes, it's called a code type, so you usually do that. And the research indicates that that there's a relationship between certain scales and somebody's personality, especially if they have 1 or 2 or possibly 3 scales that are elevated. That's a little bit different to do when you have several scales elevated.
Okay. If we took the top 3 scales here, is it something that can support a personality that is aggressive, defensive, hostile, or holds their emotions inside? If you're looking at this.
Those would be working hypotheses. In other words, theoretically, somebody who had those characteristics could end up with a profile like this.
Oh, I got
That's a weird question.
Yeah. The copyright thing on my YouTube video has been redrawn after 30 days.
Wait, what?
Yeah. I didn't pause or mute fast enough for one of the trial days in the Young Thug. So they played the video and music, and they wanted all my monies, all $1.50 ad revenue.
That kind of sucks, but I love that they're copyright claiming their own music in their own trial. I just think that's funny.
Yeah. But I disputed it, and they didn't reply for 30 days. So now I get to keep that $1.50.
Nice. There you go. Get your money.
It is day 72 plus 73 recap of the Young Thug trial. So I can't remember if I even put in ads. Yeah.
That would be something that would be to explore. So if we said, well, boy, this is, pretty major profile, and we think, for example, that, well, maybe we have somebody who does have borderline personality, or we have somebody who's very hostile and aggressive, then the next steps would be, well, let's look at those subscales and see what they say. That would be the next step in how you use a test like this.
Okay, so the rest of these, there's several other, we look at several other charts showing the subscales. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and these are something that you use, right?
Definitely.
Okay, let's take a look at page 5. Can you tell us what scale is it showing us?
Well, these are several. They're called content scales, but you have several different things. If you see at the bottom, I'll try that. You see these are terms that define different things. So, for example, this is anxiety. Again, A and X. And again, it's the same. So if you look here, normal is 50. Clinical cutoff would be 65. And so you would look at some of these scales. So if we had a hypothesis, for example, that the person was hostile, aggressive, controlling, or things like that, then the way to do this is to then look at those scales and see what they show. That way you have an idea of whether your hypothesis might be correct or not. And if it's not, well, what are other hypotheses? And then you would check those out.
Okay, so let's go with the hypothesis of somebody who's aggressive, defensive, hostile, holds their emotions inside. What do you see? Do you see anything on these content scales?
Well, there are 2 scales you would look at in this particular graph.
Leading, by
this
the way.
one here is called, well, I didn't mean to cover it up, but it's anger. If we said somebody who's angry, hostile, and all that.
That's A and G?
That's A and G. Well, so we look at that scale, and then you go up here and you see, well, it's right in the middle of the normal range. This person is not, even though they're displaying many symptoms, it doesn't appear that they're an angry person. That doesn't mean the person can't get angry. We all can get angry. But it means basically that this is not part of their personality. That would be one thing you would look at. Another would be, say,
which also can be interpreted as this is what wasn't a heat of the moment kind of thing. It was pre-planned.
Yeah. Yeah, very much.
Antisocial practices, that they're doing this on a regular basis. That would be this one here.
Is that ASP?
Correct. And you can see that's also in the normal range. So for your working hypothesis that you mentioned, those would be 2 of the scales that you would look at here.
Okay.
And then you would look at others on other pages.
All right, let's take a look at, well, so right now what we're seeing with anger and antisocial practices, we're seeing them in the normal range.
That is correct.
Okay. So let's take a look at page 6. All right, and does page 6 tell us anything? If we're looking at this hypothesis of aggression and hostility, does and the other things. What does page 6, the scales on page 6 tell us?
Well, there's 3 scales here that look at those particular dimensions that you'd want to look at. One is this one over here, which is called DO, dominance. Does the person have a need to control and dominate other people? And this particular profile is way below average, meaning that it's likely the opposite. Instead of this person being dominant, this person is more passive, submissive when you have that low. So that's one scale.
Okay.
Another one is this one, which is, well, there we go, HO, which is hostility. Is this person overall a hostile person? And you can see that's roughly in the average range here. And then the next one is OH here, which is called over-controlled hostility. In other words, do they have a lot of hostility inside that is either spending a lot of energy keeping inside or trying to control it or things like that? And you can see that's within the normal range also. So those would be 3 of the scales on this particular supplemental scale profile that you would look at for that hypothesis.
Okay. And let's take a look at page 7. These are the Psi-5 scales, right?
Yes.
Okay. And with regard to the Psi-5 scales, what does it tell us anything about our hypothesis for aggression and hostility?
This first scale is actually termed an aggressiveness scale.
Okay.
It is actually looking at, is this person have an aggressive personality? Are they aggressive in general? And this is showing, again, significantly below average, which then would lead you to a hypothesis that instead of being aggressive, this person is a personality. That doesn't, again, mean that somebody can't act aggressively at times, but what it means is as a personality, say a trait or part of them is actually more submissive, more passive.
Okay. And anything else on this page?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So based on all the scales that we just looked at, then what does it tell us about our hypothesis for aggression, hostility, and over-controlled hostility, or holding your emotions inside?
Those would say that that's not likely a good hypothesis to have, and you may need to look for other hypotheses.
Okay. What if you, after interviewing somebody, doing clinical interviews, you have a hypothesis or you have an understanding that they were involved in an abusive relationship, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
And you develop a hypothesis that the person may have PTSD or some type of anxiety.
Yes, ma'am.
Would there be scales on the MMPI-2 that we can look at for that hypothesis?
Yes, there are.
Okay, so shall we flip back to page 5?
Yes, that would be fine.
That was a 3-step hypothesis.
Yeah, this is very leading to. There's no objection.
So we're looking at
I'm
page
wondering
5.
what
So with our new
little angry elf
hypothesis,
is thinking.
what do we look at on page 5?
Well, now you're looking at somebody in your hypothetical who might be traumatized, have PTSD, be a victim of some type of trauma or abuse. So now what you look at is anxiety. So this first scale here, we mentioned before, we weren't talking about this hypothesis, but we mentioned, which is an anxiety scale. And it
I would assume, Prosecutor Elf, this hypothesis can easily be turned the other way.
Yeah. It's just, yeah, I guess. This is not going to hold up very hard, very long. That's my suspicion.
Yeah.
It's significantly elevated, as you can see up here. So that would be one of the things we would look at on that. Another one would be self-esteem. The hypothesis is that somebody who's been traumatized or in an abusive relationship, it would possibly affect their view of themselves. It would lower their self-esteem. So there's a scale right here called LSE, which is low self-esteem, and you can see this is elevated in the significant area, meaning this person does have lower self-esteem than is either healthy or normal. So those would be 2 particular scales you would look at on this particular chart.
Okay, and I just want to make sure, so when we talk about low self-esteem here and it's elevated, that means the person has lower self-esteem than normal.
Correct. So it's just like, because it says low self-esteem, higher numbers mean lower. It's like an inverse relationship. So the higher the scale, the lower the self-esteem is. Just like here, anger, the higher the scale, the more anxiety they have. So this is what we call in our language, inverse. It's reverse scoring. So that means the higher it is, the lower the self-esteem is. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right, so let's try page, is that it for this particular scale?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's take a look at page 6, and we're looking at the supplementary scales.
Yes.
Now, with our new hypothesis, with PTSD or anxiety, what do we look at here?
Well, again, this A is another way of measuring anxiety. So there's a variety of things. Pardon?
I'm sorry, that's down here at the first?
Yes.
Okay.
So there we go. So that is another way, and it is, you can see, is showing you a significant elevation. I'm not doing this real well. I keep covering the dots. Okay, so in
I
any
like
case,
this guy though. I
shows
really
you
like him.
significant elevations and anxiety. You also again, using your working
He's very
hypothesis
passionate about
of
it.
somebody from an abusive
No.
relationship, then you're going
Yeah.
to hypothesize that they're going to not only be, I'm saying that double negative, they're not going to be controlling, they're going to be the opposite. They're going to be more submissive if they've been traumatized in an abusive relationship. So they're likely to be the opposite. And that was the dominance we measured, or we talked about. Right next to it is ES, which is ego strength. In other
What's
words,
ego strength?
ego strength is a way of not only measuring self-image, self-esteem, but ego strength means how you feel about yourself overall. And the research is pretty consistent. Somebody who's been in, say, who's been suffering from PTSD, they usually internalize that, whether we're talking about a hypothetical of an abused victim or somebody coming out of combat. So they feel a lot of internalized guilt and self-blame, and that lowers their ego strength and self-esteem. And you can see their ego strength is way below average. It's near the bottom of that scale. So that would be another red flag, and that's the term I use, that so far we are consistent with that working hypothesis.
Of what?
Of somebody who's either been traumatized or possibly in an abusive relationship or something along those lines.
Okay. And what does R mean?
Repression, that's whether somebody is trying to block out unpleasant thoughts or feelings or events. So that's not in the clinical range, but it's above average, but it's not elevated like some of the other scales.
Okay.
She's not a psychopath.
And is there any other scales on here that we'd want to look at?
Yes, ma'am.
What else?
This PK scale right here, that is the one actual measure of trauma that this test does.
Do you have that
If you remember
test?
before, when I was
It's
talking about the research, it indicates that
Do I
this,
have what?
the MMPI is really not on its own.
You know,
If you
if
know
you're,
If
Go
you're a
ahead.
daddy dom or a submissive Jodi, become a member and take the test in MLS Discord.
do I have it in my Discord? Oh, just who posted that? All right, let me find it. I hope it's there. Let's see. Where's my Jodi? There it is. Who posted that? I need to give credit to. Oh, John. Awesome. Welcome to the BDSM test. All right, we're gonna take this. Not right now. Yes.
Oh,
We will begin testing your kinkiness shortly. Would you like us to help you track your evolution over time with a free account? No. This is gonna be fun. Okay. So I'm gonna take this test. Not right now, but I'm definitely taking this test. That's great.
do it live. Do it live.
I'll do it live.
Yeah.
Maybe, you know what? I'll do it on my Patreon. By the way, I have my Patreon up
Oh.
and running. I don't have much there yet, but I'm going to start doing
Post the
Patreon
link.
only streams.
Post,
Yeah, I'll do it
post
on
the
that.
link.
Yeah, I will.
Post the link.
Let me.
Yep.
Okay, hang on. Let me post it. Patreon. Let's see here. Where do I just want a link. Oh, there we go. Okay, copied link. I will put it in the chat now. This is a link to my Patreon. It's $5 a month if you want to support me. Since YouTube is not monetizing me, I'm going to start doing a lot of member-only streams there, or I'll do streams there, and then I'll repost them on YouTube and things like that. So if you want to support me, go there. And I will do this. I'll do this test over there. Maybe not today. Maybe that'll be a good stream for tomorrow. That's what I'll do. I'll do it tomorrow since I have time tomorrow. So yeah, go and support me if you want to. You can also super chat me over on Rumble or Cash at me, but I am not at all anticipating monetization on YouTube. So going other places. So yeah, this looks like a fun test. I kind of want to start it. I'm not going to start it though. I'm not going to start it. I'm going to resist, and we'll do it. We'll do it tomorrow at some point.
Yep.
That'll be fun.
A predictor.
Yep.
of like a personality disorder or PTSD, but it will give you working hypotheses. So this is the one scale that actually looks at post-traumatic stress disorder, and you can see how high up that is. It was actually the highest scale. So again, that would be consistent with our working hypothesis, or at least it says that needs to be explored in more detail.
Okay. And so when you say explored in more detail, I take it you're not telling us because the PK or the PTSD scale on here, because it's high, we know for sure she has PTSD, right? That's not.
No, that's not what I'm saying. It is not appropriate to take any one test and diagnose a person based on that. These, for lack of better words, these are working hypotheses. This is giving the clinician a guide that these things either may or may not be correct, and you need to explore further with other tests, with interviews, with collateral records, with whatever, to try to verify that. And there's one other one I missed there, by the way, and I forgot what scale it's on. But another area that would be part of our working.
Did you miss one that is part of the working hypothesis?
Yes.
Which one is that you missed?
It's called fears. Another one. It's on.
We have that mark, please.
Are you reviewing your own copy of this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And does that help you to see it there versus having to look at the screen?
Yeah. Yes, that's acceptable.
I'd ask that we not have to mark it. It's the same item.
I would ask that it be marked. He's looking at it and not what's on the.
All right, we're going to take a break in about 5 minutes, and at that time, I will let the prosecutor look at the exhibits or the witnesses' notes.
Okay.
And we'll decide if it needs to be marked at that.
Okay. So we're looking back at the
Right.
content scales. Is that where we see fears?
Yes, that's what I skipped, and I apologize, I didn't mean to. But one of the other things we would look at is fears, which is over here, and it's not in the clinical range, but it is above average.
All right, and you're referring to what it says FRS, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And it's not in the clinical range, so why would you look at it?
Well, again, we're looking at things that might contradict our hypothesis, so either one way or the other. So if, for example, the spheres was way down here and below average, then that would be somewhat contradictory, and we'd have to try to explain why. So when you don't have consistent results, then if everything is consistent one way or another that says yes or no, you can either discard it if it doesn't match. If it's consistent yes, then you go further. But if you have inconsistent findings, let's say half the tests I just showed you show significant elevations and the other half do not, then you have to try to figure out why. That's what diagnostic assessment is to try to explain what is going on. When I do the training, I look at these things and I train people on it's viewing it like a jigsaw puzzle. Your job as a clinician is to put the puzzle together. So I'm trying to decide what is going on with a person. I need to know what the picture is. And so I need all these pieces of the puzzle to fit together to finally get what the picture is. So I can't decide, for example, I don't like this part and I'm going to throw it out. That's like throwing out a piece of the puzzle, and it could be a significant piece. So I don't know what the picture looks like. So I have to figure out how all these pieces of the puzzle fit together in order to eventually come up with a diagnosis.
So even though we see fears above normal but below clinical, is that still a piece of the puzzle for you?
Yes. So, I mean, it's still in the direction. It doesn't, again, it's not something I would harp on. It's not something I would go overboard on. I would say right now, based on this test only, that you do have some consistent findings that would need to be explored.
Okay. And the consistent findings that need to be explored are consistent with what?
Anxiety, trauma.
Okay. And what does the research tell us about the MMPI-2 diagnosing borderline?
It could only be used really as, again, a working hypothesis. So you would look at some of the scales we did, but it would really say that if you think you do have, say, from whatever reason, a borderline personality, then you need to explore further. So this particular test is not designed and has never been designed to measure personality disorders. It's designed to do what we just did, looking at overall personality. It's also not designed to really assess trauma. It would give you some ideas that you have to explore further if you're doing it correctly.
All right.
So wait a
And
minute,
if
wait a
we're going
minute.
to
Is
explore
this the
further,
test
let's say
that
a hypothesis of borderline? What?
is this the test that the state used, or is this the test that both the state and the defense used? Because I thought they used the same test. They were just saying like they interpreted them wrong or something.
I have no clue.
Okay.
Honestly.
So, well, if what I'm remembering, the state and the defense used the same test, they just had different interpretations of them, then is this not defeating the defense's own argument? By him saying this doesn't test trauma, this doesn't test personality disorders, this just tests personality. I don't know. Seems odd. Okay.
might be another test that you would want to see?
The test you would look at would be what's called the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory, and I did not name it.
Okay.
It's the MCMI. That is the test that is specifically designed to look at personality disorders.
Okay, and Judge, that's probably a good time for a break then.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please try to limit your break to approximately 10 minutes. Let's say 10:45. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
Interesting.
Counsel, please
I wonder
approach.
where they're going with this.
Yeah.
Counsel, please approach is never a good way to start off.
All right, we started talking about the MCMI, right?
Yes, well, I don't think we actually talked.
We
about
mentioned it.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, can you tell us what the MCMI is? What is it?
It's the most standardized measure in our field to look specifically at at personality disorders, including borderline, paranoid, etc. So it actually is designed to assess personality disorders.
Okay, and how is it designed to do that?
By actually focusing on that population in the research and looking at what kinds of responses people who do have known personality disorders show up and how they respond. So that's what's been done over a long period of time, decades, in designing and updating and standardizing that measure. So it actually is specifically geared more to looking at the personality disorders.
All right, so let's say then we were talking about if there's this hypothesis of borderline personality disorder, is this the test then that you would want to see the results
Right?
of?
That's kind of what
Yes,
you're
ma'am.
waiting for.
I'll give you a second. You're not the first one.
Now, a little bit too fast.
Did he forget the dye in his mustache? I have gray down here in black up here, or brown.
Sure.
If there's hair here, see, look.
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it.
I forgot my hat somewhere. I can put my top hat on. I have my tricorn. I have a bunch of hats hanging up here.
This is all gray.
What are we gonna blame it on?
My hair started going gray before my beard, though.
Oh, okay.
Okay, all right, so if we're gonna conduct an MCMI test with a working hypothesis of borderline, then is that would be something accurate, or that would be something that you would want to do maybe as the next step?
Well, if you're, again, looking at that hypothesis or the possibility, yes, that would be what would be appropriate. Or if you've already administered these tests, then you would look at it. I mean, a lot of times you don't know the hypothesis ahead of time, and you would administer a battery of tests, and then you would go through, the person would have taken all of them, and then you go back and look at each one, working through it like more or less like we're doing. But it's really unusual to give a test and score it, interpret it, and then say, oh, well, I want to do this, and then go. So if you already have an idea of the areas you want to explore, you would normally give all those tests at more or less the same time.
Okay, and in this particular case, are you aware that Ms. Arias was given the MCMI test?
Yes,
And did you review the profile results?
yes.
All right, and I'm showing you Exhibit 541. What are we looking at in Exhibit 541?
These are the profile results for this particular test. It's a different format, which isn't relevant. It's just different tests are viewed differently, but it's the same idea. So, but this is scored a little bit differently. So when you look at this 75 here, that would be more of what we would call our clinical cutoff. They don't call this T-scores, and they call it base rates. But the idea is somebody who's at 75 or above, that's in the clinical range or the areas we'd want to look at. So the first three scales here, okay, all right, so there are what is called the validity scales, like we were talking about before, and whether the person is attempting to distort their answers, fake good, fake bad, things like that, lie. So these different ones look at whether they're willing to disclose, that's the first one, whether they are trying to answer a little bit more favorable. In other words, this particular elevation here at 67 means it's above average. It's not clinical, but it's above average, meaning the person may be trying to present themselves in a little bit more favorable way than they really are. And then this is putting themselves down. Are they actually trying to look worse than they are? And that's not. So when you get a score that's starting to get elevated, if you get it way up here, then you start worrying about validity. In other words, is this test able to be interpreted correctly. But when you start getting in this range or up here, then you start thinking, well, this profile might actually be a little bit lower than is what occurs in reality.
Okay,
So
let me stop you there so we can understand. So based on these, the top 3 scales here, the validity scales, overall, can you tell us, is this test going to be considered valid?
Yes,
Okay. And then you were talking about the desirability scale, and we see that that's at a 67, which you were saying that's not at the clinical level?
it's correct, but it's
Okay.
above average.
Right. So explain to us then the above average on that particular, the desirability.
Well, it just means that you don't go crazy. It's not in the clinical range. You're not having invalid, but it says there's a tendency on this person to, on this particular test, to perhaps try to look a little bit better, a little bit more favorable than they might actually be in real world, real life. And so in a clinician's or a diagnostic way, you sort of assume then that you would move the profile up a little bit, but you're still going to look at what are the high scales. But it means that, again, it could mean that these scales are actually a little bit lower than they would be if the person, if this scale was down here, for example, like these others, then the assumption is that all these scales in here probably would be up just a little higher, not a particular scale, just in general. Did that help?
Not really.
Okay.
With the desirability scale, and you see that it's elevated, what does that mean for like something like one of the other scales, like PTSD? We see it's at 69.
Well, it means that in reality, if this person had completely answered in a way that wasn't desirable at all, that 69 could be a little bit higher, and you might need to pay attention to it. But again, we're talking about working hypothesis. We're not saying we're going to go overboard, and again, we're not going to diagnose somebody just on one test, but we're starting to look for patterns among the tests.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about our working hypothesis back to borderline personality disorder.
Yes.
What do we see with regard to the MCMI, a test that, as you say, is specifically designed to detect personality disorders?
Yes. So one of the ones you just mentioned is right here, borderline personality disorder. And you can see it says a score of 11, which is right here, which is, if anything, in the low or below average category. It's not elevated. It's definitely not one of the major scales. So that would tend to indicate that your working hypothesis is not likely correct.
Okay. And then what about if we have a working hypothesis for anxiety or trauma or PTSD? Can we learn anything from these scales based on that working hypothesis?
Under the same conditions that you don't want to go overboard, specifically because this test is not designed to actually diagnose others, but it gives you a working hypothesis. Again, anxiety right here is at the clinical level. PTSD, which is the second highest scale, is there. This is not in the clinical area, but it is elevated, but this is. So that would support a working hypothesis of an anxiety disorder or PTSD. Again, that's the way you would view it. You wouldn't, based on, if I had only given this test, I wouldn't go out and say this person has PTSD or an anxiety disorder. But at the same token, I wouldn't say they had a borderline personality disorder. So you have to put everything together. That's the pieces of the puzzle. But this would not support borderline, and if anything, would support more anxiety-oriented things.
All right. And the fact that we have the PTSD scale at 69, so not clinical, when you talk about pieces of the puzzle, is that still a piece of the puzzle even though it's not in that clinical range?
Yes, it's still going with your working hypothesis of it's definitely the second highest scale, and so it's something to consider. And so theoretically, your next steps would be, well, let's test out. If we think that this person is suffering from PTSD or a trauma or an anxiety disorder, let's administer trauma inventories or something specifically designed to assess trauma. That would be appropriate.
Okay. All right. So, and as far as you know, the trauma inventories were given to Ms. Arias, right?
Yes.
Okay.
69.
And trauma inventory, the TSI-1, can it be computer scored as well as hand scored?
Yes.
And are you, well, Judge, may I approach?
Here out of loyalty, not this psycho. You don't like
I'm showing
Jodi?
you exhibit 629 and 628. And then I'm showing you also exhibit 646. So 628 and 629, are those hand scored?
Yes, this would be, well, this is the profile you would end up with. Usually if you hand score it, you get the numbers and then you plot it and it goes on a graph like this. And the other one, I don't know what number you said, 646 would be the computer scoring printout of the same test. It just puts it in computer forms, and it does a profile with this that tells you what's going on with it as well.
Okay. And can you review that to tell us if the computer scoring matches the hand scoring?
The scales that are on this form are all matched
What?
Bobby says the neighbor drinks his milk every day. Yes, he does. This guy's a little dry, but here's the thing. So this witness is supposedly a rebuttal witness from the defense to discredit the state's expert witness that did an evaluation of Jodi and said she's fine. She just likes to murder people. Yep. But I think in the process, they're also devaluing the testing that was run by the defense that said she's all woohoo. And he keeps saying like, well, this isn't really a personality test. It doesn't score personality traits, and it does. And her scores are not rising to the level of, you know, crazy, but they're there. I don't know. I feel like this was a bad witness to call.
Yeah, I mean, his first 30 minutes when he was talking about experience and stuff like that, yeah, that was an actual rebuttal witness. But this is, well,
oh, you're over the psycho chat. Oh, you mean the testimony from experts regarding her psychology and stuff? Yeah. It gets a little tedious, but I'm looking at this thinking, this is not good for the defense. This isn't anything that's helping them.
No,
but not crazy enough. Yeah, she's crazy, but not crazy enough. Porcelain Thunder. That's exactly what this guy is saying.
The ones from the computer score also does additional summary scales that's not on this form.
Okay, so the hand scored forms don't have any summary scales on it?
That's correct. You would write them in.
Okay, and the computer printout form, the computer scored form, is that something that you did?
Yes, ma'am.
And how
my staff did it and I checked it.
Okay.
I think one of them, I believe the postdoc fellow actually ran on the computer.
Yeah, that's what this defense witness is saying.
How is it that you were able to do that?
Yeah.
We have the scoring programs for these various tests. So on the trauma symptom inventory, especially since we were a research site and we've been using it ever since, we actually have the computer scoring program. I mean, people can buy it, but we're a training institute, so we have those things. So we have that. We also have the one for MMPI. We also have the one for MCMI. So many of these things we were able to do as part of the training of our graduate students and doctoral students, or as part of research.
Okay. And did you have what's called raw data, or basically Ms. Arias's answers, to be able to then feed into the computer to get this computer score?
Yes, ma'am.
And is that how it's done?
He adopted this mustache in the late 80s and has kept it ever since.
We don't tend to do that. We tend to
assessment.
give them the questions, let them fill out an answer sheet, and then we transfer it to the computer.
Okay, but you never met Ms. Arias, right?
That's correct.
So you're working from what you've received?
That's correct.
Okay. And with regard, is it 646?
Yes, ma'am.
So does that reflect an accurate scoring of this raw data that Dr. DeMarte had given you, that you've seen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, can you pause it real quick?
And the computer scoring
The first part of his testimony was really to discredit the state's witness and her experience. And I thought that was okay. It wasn't the greatest. It was just okay. And I thought that's all they were using this guy for. And then they went into the whole testing of Jodi Arias. And it's kind of counterproductive, in my opinion. He hasn't disproved anything that the state's witness said, other than she's claimed like she had 8 years of experience because for 5 of those years she was in school but still practicing, like learning on the job kind of thing. And he's like, that doesn't really count. That's not really practice. So she basically, the state's expert, had 3 years of experience, not 8. Okay, great. It doesn't really, it's not a home run or anything, but then everything else he says is counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, he's more or less invalidating that believe all women witness, who said, oh, she's absolutely high PTSD, everything. And then, memory guy.
Dear men, stay away from crazy. Ooh, speaking of, I was out with Damien. You guys know Damien from my show last night. And I went over the 30-point system with him. And so we have a stream we're going to actually do. And we're going to do the 30-point system. We're going to finally go through that.
You are really wanting to make that happen.
I am, because I explained it to him in like a minute. And he was like, oh, my God, that makes perfect sense. We got to get that out there. We've got to spread the good news.
Did the summary scales to that?
That's correct.
And do those summary scales then match or make sense with what the raw data that you saw going in?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And Judge, at this time, defense would move into Exhibit 646.
Any objection?
I haven't seen it, so I need to know it.
my butter hair. And my butter hair is awesome. My butter hair going. Can't really see it with the black background. That's intentional. Yes, I have a 30-point system, Ghostly, as opposed to the 1 through 10 rating for hotness of guys and gals.
And Dr. Gauffner, you told us some of the things that your institute does with regard to trauma. Do you have other specialized training with regard to trauma?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you do speaking engagements or training? What is it? How do you have this additional expertise in training or trauma?
It actually grew out of working with abused women and children and child abuse victims. We realized that there was a major connection to trauma. So back in the early 1980s, I started actually doing more research on trauma and actually started going to specific trainings with some of the people around the country. We continued to work. We then began to assess for trauma. We did some of our own research with the clinic I had set up and also at the university and at the crisis center and shelter for battered women and children that I helped build. So we were doing research and training and practice all in this area. And then I ended up getting involved in establishing major organizations dealing with this and still do.
All right. And what about part of being a psychologist is do you do any type of articles, like writing articles for journals or chapters for books or books?
All of the above. I have co-authored books in these various topic areas, including trauma, domestic violence, child abuse. I actually haven't counted lately. I think I've edited or co-edited or written or co-written probably about 45 books going back into the early 1980s. Chapters in books, research and other types of articles in what's called peer-reviewed journals. I actually have not counted how many I've done, to be honest. It's something we regularly do, and we train our people. So the research that I'm supervising, for example, we work with them as they become professionals to publish their work and present them at conferences. So I oversee quite a bit of that as well, and do training myself all over the country and in other countries about trauma, about domestic violence, about how they're all interconnected, and how they affect children, how they affect victims, treatment programs. We've designed treatment programs for victims and for offenders and for children, published books on that, hosted national think tanks on dealing with children exposed to violence growing up in homes like this. All of those I'm involved in a variety of different ways.
And what about peer review? What does peer review mean?
With journals, which is the way you actually look at the research, when you have, say, an article, clinical article or treatment, in other words, or research, to get it published in a reputable journal, the journal would need to be peer reviewed and usually anonymous. So that what that means, like with the journals I edit, an article gets submitted to us, and that we send it out to people who are known in the field who are on my boards to review this, but they don't know who the author is, and the author doesn't know who reviewed it, because we have like 100 people for each journal, and they provide feedback and they make recommendations as to whether this meets scientific merit, whether this is worthy of publication. Based on that, it goes through processes of revision until the quality is acceptable to reviewers. That's what peer review means. For research to be recognized, others have to have reviewed it to make sure it was done appropriately, to make sure it actually is meaningful, and a whole bunch of things that we don't need to go into. But then it gets published. And the peer reviewed good journals are all peer reviewed. They're all usually anonymous, what we call double blind. So reviewers don't know who the authors don't know who the reviewers are, and then us in the editorial process make the final decisions to get something published.
So are you involved in the editorial process?
Yes, ma'am.
On several journals?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know which ones?
I hope so.
Which ones?
I'm the editor of the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma. That's been out 15 years. It deals with all areas and it comes out 10 times a year. I'm the editor of the Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma. It's newer. It's been out about 7 years now. It comes out 4 times a year. These get disseminated worldwide. I'm also the editor of the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse. That's the oldest journal I've been involved in. It's in its 22nd year. I'm also the editor now of the Journal of Family Violence. These are different publishers that do this, and we have staff. We train our doctorate students and others. I have a whole staff that works with me on the editorial process. So this is a major operation. The Journal of Family Violence comes out 8 times a year. So they all come out different times, but they all get disseminated to professionals worldwide. That's how people get educated about what the current research tells you. That's how we can know, for example, that there was no floating profile, because somebody has done the research on it and it gets published in peer-reviewed journals that mental health and other professionals have access to, either online or hard copies. So yes, we're involved in all that.
Okay. And earlier when you were speaking about Dr. Gatchell writing some articles about floating profiles, are those things that were actual research and peer reviewed?
I believe most of them were peer reviewed, but they weren't really focusing on research. Most of them were focusing more on clinical practice. So peer reviewed doesn't always have to be research. So if somebody has a treatment program or a theoretical idea or framework, as long as it goes through the same process, that's how we learn. That's how we move the field forward. That's how we all continue to learn about things we now know that we didn't know 20 years ago, things like that.
Okay, and then later on was the research about research actually relating to floating profiles and borderline personality.
Yes, that was actual research that again was peer reviewed and then published, not in my journals. I mean, we weren't involved in that, but in other recognized journals.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about then Exhibit 646, which is the computer printout or computer scoring of the TSI. And this would be, are you familiar with the trauma symptom inventory that was conducted by Dr. DeMarte? Those are the hand scoring you just saw, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you know the timeline in which she gave it to Ms. Arias? In other words, when did she want these symptoms to be reported from?
She indicated that this particular one was to be from equivalent of 2007, 2008, prior to arrest. At least that's my understanding.
Okay, and is that something possible?
Well, it's not ideal. I mean, you're having the person try to recall the way they were then and to respond. Ideally, it would have been good to administer that test at the time and then possibly again at a different time. It's definitely not the ideal way of doing something, what we call retrospective. It's not what I would like to do. Ideally, I'd like to do it at the time, but if we aren't able to, then at least it gives us an idea. Again, not conclusively, not to make a diagnosis, but again, we're looking at working hypothesis, what makes sense. So it does give you some information.
Okay. All right. And so let's talk about the working hypothesis of anxiety or PTSD and trauma. Okay.
Yes. Well, that's the thing. If you have the profile, it might make it easier to see. But because this lists it, the other shows you on a summary scale. Like yes.
This one?
Yes.
Oh.
Because then it's easier maybe for people to see that.
Okay.
Even though it's a little smaller, again, so we look at what's average, what's above average, what's clinical. Oh, that was nice. So 50 again here is average. 65 again, a little bit like the MMPI, is in the clinical cutoff range. So those are the things we look at. These three scales here on this side are the validity scales. Did the person answer consistently? Are they giving responses that are really sort of bizarre and atypical? Are they giving you things that seem to fit in?
I feel like this is a repeat
people,
that we've gone over so many times.
All in, all in the average range below clinical, meaning it's a valid profile. So that's the first thing we look at. Then we look at which of the scales that are elevated above this level. And you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the 10 test scales are elevated in the clinical area. So we focus on that, and then we come back to these over here.
There's the summary scale.
Those are the 3 summary scales. So what this instrument does is it not only looks at trauma overall, which is this right here, based on these results. Well, the other scales, I don't know how to get, like your hand was there, but, and then these tell you other parts of the overall scale, like what's the mood level, what's the way this person views themselves. So these sort of combine the whole test into those 3 summary scales to determine whether it's likely that this person suffered trauma and or may have a diagnosis of PTSD.
And this particular instrument,
excuse me,
does it necessarily focus on one particular trauma, or does it talk about facts of a trauma, or just trauma in general?
No, this one is looking at trauma in general and symptoms and impact. In fact, it doesn't ask specifically for what may have traumatized you. It doesn't focus on the particular act. It focuses on the impact of whatever this person is reviewing. So it's actually looking, the reason it's called a symptom inventory, it's asking you what symptoms you may have. It is actually not necessarily asking you if you've been traumatized or had a traumatic event. It's saying, like, in the last, whatever this time period is, you know, have you had nightmares? Have you had
by now
difficulty going to sleep?
This is horrible.
Have you been overly concerned about your sexual interactions. I mean, it does all those things. I don't want to go into too many. I don't want to give you the questions, but basically it's asking the person about symptoms. There's 100 of these. So it's looking at that. And then because of the research that's been done over a couple of decades, it puts it together now into these different scales that we can now interpret based on that. So it's not asking the person, him or herself, at all about what might have caused this
so bored.
behavior or what the action might have been. So, I mean, it could also be that this
Testimony is
person has
horrible.
had
Yeah, but
several
we
traumatic
can't
incidences
skip
in their life
because
because we're focusing on their symptoms now.
Super
mean-
chat to skip.
Yes.
Super
Okay.
chat to
And
skip.
so we talked about these 10 scales and then the summary scales.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you aware that Dr. DeMarte indicated that the TSI does not have summary scales, that they don't exist?
Objection indicated that the hand scorer did not have it, not the computer.
This is so bad. This is so boring. The jury doesn't care. You're not making any points. I guarantee there's not a single jury question for this witness. What are your thoughts, Nick?
Bored
I don't
out
see
of
a
my-
single jury question.
No, definitely not. And I mean, if this would have been the defense first witness, it would have been more interesting. But this is one of their last rebuttal witnesses, and Jesus Christ,
It's bad.
but they do they have much choice? I mean, apparently has the best credentials of all the psychologists that have testified so far, and maybe that is why he can only
continue.
testify like this.
So, Dr. Gauffner, do you have information that Dr. DeMarte at some point indicated that summary scales do not exist?
Objection. What we indicated, excuse me, she
What? We
What
can
was
skip
it,
10
teacher?
minutes. Thank you, John. Thank you.
Woo!
Thank you.
Hallelujah.
We are 1:43:53. Let's skip up to 1.
Oh, yeah. I'll keep an eye out for my Cash App, too. Just in case anyone is Cash Apping me to skip.
All right.
Oh, I have money here.
10 minutes. Can we skip more?
No,
Thank you, John.
it's not from today.
Oh,
Back post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, I want to emphasize, if all somebody gave was this one instrument, and then they said this person suffers from PTSD, that would not be appropriate. It's part of your jigsaw puzzle and part of looking at working hypotheses. So, but this is indicating clinically above cutoffs for trauma, overall trauma. The next one is self, meaning this person is having some major issues with the way they feel about themselves, view themselves, identity issues, self-confidence are all being impacted by whatever these trauma or traumas are. And lastly, dysphoria, that this is affecting their mood, depression, anxiety. These things are being affected by whatever, the traumas are. That's the way this would be viewed. And then you'd want to compare it to say if the test had been administered at another time.
Okay. And are you aware of whether or not this test, the TSI-1, was administered at another time?
Yes, I am.
And when was that?
It was administered a year and a half before this, actually in the spring of 2010.
Okay. And who administered that?
Dr. Cheryl Karp.
Okay. And so, and it was the TSI-1, right? It's the same exact
Well, then
test?
it was appropriate. The new one hadn't come out.
Okay. And are you aware of the scaled results from Dr. Karp's TSI-1?
Yes, ma'am.
And are they similar? Are they different? What do you see?
Similar. The validity scales over here were also normal, according to Dr. Karp. And then
testifying from another document.
I don't think he was looking at a document, Judge.
no, I was just pointing on the screen.
All right.
The lack of foundation as to the other document. Where is it?
Judge, may we approach?
You may.
Yeah, I'm not sure that one would get past the judge's scrutiny, but I could definitely see that. What's funny is if they put stuff like that in there, it won't necessarily get asked of the witness, but the attorneys are going to see it. And they read something like this, dear God, why are you putting this boring testimony up in front of us? Oh, that would be amazing. It's like a little note to the attorneys. That would be great. Yeah, of course Jodi sees herself as a victim in all of this. That dog is a heartbreaker? What dog? Was there a dog? Where are we? What's going on? Nick, you're muted. I don't know if you were talking or not. We're just sitting
I
sidebar.
wasn't.
Oh, okay. What? No. What is
You may
that?
continue.
All right, Dr. Gauffner, just let me know if you need to review, if you need to look at Dr. Karp's report. If you don't need to, that's fine.
I do not.
Okay. All right, so tell me that we were talking about the similarities and differences.
Yes. So validity scales were in the normal range on that test also. In her test, 6 of the 10 scales here were clinically elevated. The difference, so it's a similar profile, a year and a half apart. The differences between Dr. Karp's and Dr. DeMarte's is that this scale here that you see, it's called intrusive experiences. That means like flashbacks, the thoughts coming back into your head when you don't want to. When Dr. Karp did it, this was in the elevated range as one of the scales. So it had dropped in that year and a half. And then these 2 scales, the ones with sexual concerns and dysfunctional sexual behavior, had increased.
Get into those.
Those
What
were
the
not
sexual
in the
concerns?
clinical range. So over time, those things were becoming more dominant in the way the person who was thinking about it, getting more concerned, reflecting over time, and these scales now became much more problematic. On the summary scales, both the trauma and the dysphoria scales were clinically elevated, dysphoria a little bit higher. So even though it's still in the clinical range, the mood wasn't quite as depressed a year and a half prior to this as then, but the self scale had moved from the high average range. It had now, over time, thinking more about self-image, self-concept, had now moved into the clinical range. But in general, both tests would indicate, even though by different people over different time periods, significant trauma, significant issues that were causing major symptoms to the way this person views themselves, the way they are experiencing things, the anxiety level. And so they would be consistent with an anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder.
And if Dr. DeMarte termed the similarities between the TSI-1 given by Dr. Karp and the TSI-1 given by herself, Dr. DeMarte, if she termed those as similar, pretty much the same, would you agree with that?
Yes, they were, with those 3 different changes, which you want to note, because again, your job as a clinician or a diagnostician is to understand the data there. Your job is not to make it go one way or another, it's to help understand it for that jigsaw puzzle. So yeah, those would be similar profiles, and you'd want to understand what might change some.
You might want to understand what
some of the changes were, and does it make sense? So, but yes, I would agree with her that they are similar profiles.
Okay. And on this TSI-1, how many questions are there?
100.
100. All right. And so that means that a year and a half apart, in order to get these similar profiles, what does a person have to do to get similar profiles with these 100 questions?
Well, they have to answer the questions of what symptoms they're experiencing. There's no way somebody would know. Hopefully be relying on what they're actually experiencing. It would be very unlikely that somebody a year and a half apart would remember how they answered those questions. So that's a way of also checking, is this a pattern of behavior? In other words, did something all of a sudden happen in that time period that added and the scales went up? Somebody who was functioning normally before, and now they've had a traumatic reaction and now they're suffering. You can use the test that way. But with a year and a half apart, we're looking at a consistent pattern of trauma.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else that you would do with regard to this test?
Well, after that, I mean, you now have working hypotheses. So I'm sorry.
Approach, please.
Oh, what was that objection? I didn't catch it. I didn't hear what it was. I don't know if it was too quiet.
Hypotheses. So I'm sorry.
Approach, please.
Yeah, I can't hear it.
No.
Tedious. Tedious. That's all I'm going to say. Hi, everybody. How are we doing? Nick, can you fast forward through the sidebars? This is sidebar like 40,000, by the way.
Yeah.
TSI. What you see in Dr. DeMarte's TSI and Dr. Karp's TSI, the trauma tests, what does it do with our hypothesis for PTSD or anxiety or trauma?
Well, it supports those issues. So then the question, again, this test doesn't tell you what the trauma was or is. So the next is to determine what is the traumatic events, singular or plural, that led to the consistent hypotheses now across all these tests. So are we talking about particular events, a long-term history of events? That's where your records, collateral information, your interviews need to focus, is trying out to explain what may have led to this situation.
Okay. Before we move on, can we talk about whether or not the TSI, this trauma test, if it can tell us anything about borderline personality?
Well, we can talk about it, but
I forgot when I chat,
Okay.
it comes out
Can
as
you use this test in any way to support
bad.
a hypothesis of borderline personality?
Not really. I mean, it's not designed to deal with personality disorders at all. It's designed to deal with trauma. Now, the difficulty is those things overlap. So
what things overlap?
Borderline personality disorder or borderline characteristics can impact or be impacted by trauma. So impaired self-reference, dissociation, some of these things that come about from trauma can also be involved in, say, borderline personality disorder. So this test is in no way designed to assess a personality disorder, but theoretically,
valid
if a person has borderline personality disorder and no traumas in their history or nothing that was a traumatic reaction, then you might see some of these particular scales elevated, but theoretically, you shouldn't see this elevated, or you shouldn't see some of these.
When you say this, what do you mean?
I'm sorry, the trauma scale would not be elevated, but you could get certain scales elevated. For example, you could get the dissociation scale elevated. You can get the impaired self-reference, not from trauma, but something else. But then the trauma things like defensive avoidance, like this trauma one here, intrusive experiences, those things then would tend not to be, because they tend to be associated with trauma. So you can indeed have somebody who has, in our language, co-occurring disorders. That means they have two things. They could be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline or other things. Or you could have somebody who has post-traumatic stress disorder and they have major depression. It is incumbent on the diagnostician to look at that, because in our diagnostic code, it basically says if you have a clinical diagnosis, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, that's what you diagnose. You don't diagnose a personality disorder unless it is actually co-occurring. That means unless you can show that separate from the trauma, you have these other things going on. What that would mean more in English is that if somebody had a long history of harming themselves, of unstable relationships, of dissociating, of suicide attempts, or things like that, long before going back into adolescence, then you might have a borderline personality disorder. Now, that doesn't eliminate PTSD, but if your trauma comes from something that happened, say, in adulthood, then that would be a reason to give both diagnoses. But if all your symptoms of borderline or anything else occurred at the time or after the traumatic reaction, then it's not appropriate to diagnose with that. You diagnose with the PTSD or anxiety disorder or whatever it is that's the major issue going on. And that's listed in the manual for diagnosticians. So you could have two, not based on this test, but that's the way you would use the test to look at determining diagnoses.
Okay. So as a hypothetical, if someone got PTSD from an abusive relationship, being involved in an abusive relationship.
Yeah, so my Patreon is an alternative to YouTube membership. You can go over there. It's $5 a month, Brandon, and you can comment on all the videos that I'll post over there. I was going to try to set this one up, and then I forgot about it. It's an extra step that it doesn't take that long. It's like clicking two buttons, but I got to get in the habit of doing it. So all of my live streams are going to be over there. I'm going to do a live stream exclusive to Patreon tomorrow. So that's why I'm pushing it a little bit. So it'll be like a member-only stream kind of thing. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. More sidebars. More sidebars.
You suffer from.
Let me proceed.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Gauffner, as a hypothetical, if someone were to get PTSD or suffer from PTSD because they were involved in an abusive relationship, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
And because of this abusive relationship, they were suffering from trauma, okay? But they also exhibited borderline personality characteristics. What you're telling us is that they could have both, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But would it be appropriate in coming to a conclusion about borderline personality, would it be appropriate to use any factors during the time of this abusive relationship in which the trauma is occurring?
In order to diagnose
Borderline.
borderline? No. If you have a diagnosis of PTSD or anxiety disorder or something from known events and matches, say, your testing, and all your borderline behaviors, actions occurred during that same time period, then no, that would not. You'd have to have a prior history of those behaviors long-term, going back into adolescence, to diagnose any personality disorder. So they would have to have both to get both diagnoses.
Okay. And when you talk about long-term, back into adolescence, are you looking at just one thing that happened, or are you going to want to see patterns of these behaviors?
For diagnosing borderline, you'd need to have patterns of behavior, and it would need to meet all the various criteria for borderline that would have to have a history of that. You wouldn't be able to have two things that happen, say, in adolescence, two other things that happen, say, when you're 25, three other things that happened when you were 32, and then you're adding those up. You would really need to have a history of those criteria and a pretty consistent history of those things happening before whatever other events you're talking about.
Okay. So we would want to see a consistent history then before this abusive relationship then?
In your hypothetical, yes.
Okay. So then based on what we see in this TSI and the other TSI, then is it consistent or not with our working hypothesis of PTSD and anxiety?
Right now, it's consistent.
Okay. And is it,
Lefty.
and when we don't just look at the TSI and we look at the other tests that we've discussed so far this morning, what does that do to our hypothesis with PTSD and anxiety and trauma?
Right now, all your tests are not supporting a personality disorder. All your tests are supporting some type of anxiety or trauma disorder.
Okay. All right. So you talked about after this, is there a specific test that can go into the types of trauma?
There are quite a few, two more typically used ones.
All right. What are those?
The detailed assessment of post-traumatic stress, abbreviated DAPS, also created by Dr. Briere. That one tends to focus more on the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and it talks about particular events that the person lists. That one I view as being better because it has validity scales again, and it's more detailed, it's more current. Another one, though, is called the the post-traumatic distress scale, the PDS.
That was great. That was great.
That should have woken the jury up.
Yeah. We're just trying to look, actually, so Nick and I in the background are trying to find someone to send you guys to, redirect you to, because we've only got like 20-some minutes left of this, and nobody is streaming. I was looking at the Glare, who's been involved with Karen retrial and Turtle Boy, but he just ended his stream. It's no longer live.
We have Colonel Kurtz, who is doing a roundup on a bunch of subjects. Let's see, what was she?
But did she post it now?
Yeah, she posted it now on Twitter, but I don't know the timing of it. Hold on.
Hey, Bruce. Yes, Bruce will be joining me tonight at 7 p.m. You guys don't miss out.
Yeah, she is scheduled to start at 2 p.m.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
yeah.
Cool. Then that will work.
She's a bunch of subjects, the basketball player, Ricada,
there's so many things
and Marilyn Manson, and a bunch of stuff.
That'll be good.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. That's where we'll send you guys after. Cool. That's what if I looked a little distracted, I was trying to find somebody to send you all to in like 20 minutes. So we're good to go now. Maybe if she allows redirect.
Let's see here.
All right. Now we're on the 20,000th. She doesn't allow redirect.
No, she doesn't allow. Of course she doesn't.
I'm gonna message her.
Yeah.
All right.
which also has a research basis. It does not have validity scales, but it also focuses on particular trauma incidents.
Okay. And when you talk about research basis, what do you mean?
But it means that there's some research behind it, but it's not a major norm group type of test. It's all, that test, the post-traumatic distress, is based more on criteria. In other words, we say, does this person have this behavior? Does it have this behavior? Does it have this behavior? We know that those are the behaviors that make up the diagnosis. But it's not like some of these other tests where they're actually researched on how people check off symptoms. It's hard to describe. In my language, it's like the difference between quantitative research and qualitative. One uses research data and statistical analysis. The other is matching the questions with the diagnosis you're trying to end up with or to verify. It's a little hard to explain without getting too technical, but so there are different ways of looking at the thing, but the PDS does not have specific validity scales.
Okay. And without validity scales, can it still be used?
Oh, yes. It's telling you what the client, whoever it is saying, and whether what they're saying matches the criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD and what level of severity it's at. But it's based on, again, I mean, these are all based on self-report, but there's no check on that one. Basically, the client says, yes, I had this traumatic incident, and then you ask about a variety of things related to that incident. You know, did you have nightmares about it? Did you, were you afraid? And then you check off these boxes, and then it produces whether the person met the various criteria for that, for PTSD.
Okay.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right. And did you review the PDS test that was given to Ms. Arias?
Yes, ma'am.
And in your review of the PDS test that was given to Ms. Arias, did she meet according to that test, did she meet the criteria for PTSD?
Yes, ma'am.
And you said that's what it's specifically designed to do, this particular test?
Is designed to do two things. One is to tell you whether the person met all the criteria, whether it would qualify, if they did, for what's called an acute onset, meaning it happened right after the event, or a more chronic onset, meaning it's continued and had longer effects. And then it's designed to tell you what level of severity that is.
Okay. All right. And in this particular test, it focuses, unlike the TSI, is it focusing on what the trauma might be? Or
Yes.
the different traumas the person has suffered?
It's based on what the person has indicated. So it asks the person a whole bunch of questions like, were you assaulted by a stranger? Were you assaulted by a family member? Were you assaulted sexually? Were you assaulted physically? So you are noting the type of events that you have experienced. And then it's saying, okay, of these various events, which do you feel was either the most traumatic or the one that you feel is impacting you the most? And then the questions go from there.
Okay. And with regard to this particular PDS test, on part 2, and I'm showing you exhibit 550, on part 2, does it tell us under question 14, does it tell us what the person feels the most significant trauma is?
That, yes, that box number 4 checks off what the particular question is.
Okay. And number 4, is that relate to an assault by a stranger?
Yes, that's what that question is asking.
Okay. And then it asks the person to briefly describe the traumatic event, right?
Yes.
And we see here that it says assaulted / life threatened.
Yes, ma'am.
So my question to you then is, if there is an assault on this person and this person felt that her life was threatened, and she says on this test that it is traumatic to her, okay, would it matter as far as PTSD or trauma is concerned whether or not who did it to her?
The test would not matter, the criterion would not, because it's then assuming this is the what you're talking about, this event, and then it's from there on, it doesn't focus on the event, it focuses on the impact of that event in, you know, nightmares, in intrusive experiences, in anxiety, in disruption of your life, things like that. That's what it focuses on from that point on.
All right. And in your experience, you've told us that you have a lot of experience with obviously trauma victims and domestic violence victims. In your experience, do people ever not report correctly about who assaulted them?
Objection, relevance.
Approach.
It's a lot of sidebars. I haven't kept count of them.
May continue.
Hey,
All right, Dr. Gauffner, so the fact that we are,
I
the fact that,
she wasn't arrested in her car.
Who, Jodi?
No. She was arrested during an interview. She came in
Grace
for an
was arrested
interview.
with 2 knives and a gun in her car. No, she never had a gun. She never had the knives. They never found any of that stuff.
No.
And she came in voluntarily for an interview. Actually, I think they went to her house with a search warrant, and then they just sort of like, will you come with us? And then she went with them. But they didn't find knives and guns in her car. They never found them. That was the problem.
Mm.
if we're talking about somebody who doesn't report accurately about who caused this trauma, does that ultimately affect whether or not they actually have trauma? Let me ask that in a different way. If a person says that, let me give you this example. If a person says that they were attacked by a tiger, but in reality they were attacked by a bear. Either way, they're telling you that they've suffered trauma. Is it going to matter one way or the other?
No, not for this test or for a diagnosis of PTSD. It's the reaction.
He's not finished answering.
Overruled. You may continue.
It's the reaction to the event that is assessed and goes into the diagnosis. As long as there was some type of traumatic event, the diagnosis requires there to be a traumatic event. It doesn't require what it is. So either one of those would qualify, but the test is focusing on the reaction to it.
Okay. And I think you talked about, with regard to PTSD, does it have to be one event or can it be multiple events?
Oh, it can easily be multiple. I mean, you can have somebody who suffers a trauma in childhood or from child abuse or being bullied to later being a victim of date rape, to later being a victim of domestic violence. Unfortunately, what we know from the research.
What do we know from the research with regard to PTSD and having one event versus multiple events?
Overruled.
We know from the research that if you have a traumatic event early on, what is called adverse childhood experiences, and there are a variety of things that qualify for that, whether in childhood or adolescence, it increases the odds of being victimized again if there's no intervention or treatment. So it's not unusual for somebody, unfortunately, to have some type of traumatic stressor that produces.
Yeah, Nurmi, the defense attorney, got disbarred for writing a tell-all book about Jodi Arias and essentially breaching attorney-client privilege.
Yep.
The prosecutor, the angry little elf, got disbarred, but for completely unrelated reasons.
Well,
I think the only one that's still licensed and still practicing is the female attorney because the judge has since retired, although with a clean record, I understand.
Yeah. Prosecutor Elf, Angry Elf, voluntarily gave up his bar card because if he hadn't, they would have had the hearing with his former employees testifying about his misconduct. And that would have been bad. Yeah, that would have been really bad.
Yeah, it's about the only way to say it. That would have been bad.
Yeah. And it's... Here we go again.
No more sidebars. We get a
I'll
free
finish what
skip
you
over
were
the
telling us.
sidebar.
You continue.
Finish what you were telling us about with childhood trauma and unfortunately what happens.
When somebody has experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences, and the more they experience, the worse it is later on too, they are much more at risk for later traumatic experiences that affect their mental health, their physical health. We have a lot of research now that shows that this is a lifespan approach if there's no intervention, so that somebody who's been victimized in childhood is a much greater risk of being victimized later, or if they're victimized in adolescence, for example, a victim of date rape or they end up at a higher risk for other victimizations later on.
Okay.
So it does not have to be one event. You can have one event. You could have a stressor like an earthquake or something like that, or an assault, but you can also have a whole series of chronic events where you may not have been physically or sexually touched, but you grew up in a home that had so much trauma and chaos and abuse that it traumatizes you.
Okay. All right. I want to talk to you about and I don't know the full name for it, the RAT, Wechsler. The RAT test.
RAT is called the Wide Range Achievement Test, and there's various versions.
Okay. All right. Are you aware of whether or not Dr. DeMarte gave this test?
Yes.
All right. What is this test? What does this test mean?
This trial
It's an
was
achievement
from
test. If you do the
2013.
various subscales, it'll tell you what level the person is reading, spelling, arithmetic, etc. Like the 8th grade level.
sorry, I was just saying this trial is from 2013. The unaliving happened in 2007, I want to say. Am I right with that?
2008.
2008, 2007, 2008. She went on trial. It started in late 2012. Right now, like in real time, it's like May 2013. So we're not doing a recap. We're watching the whole thing through for a couple of reasons. One, we've been watching current trials and we feel like there's a lot of shenanigans. Two, this was a very salacious case at the time and I didn't really watch it at the time. So I kind of want to see how this went through. But I wanted to see how trials have changed over the last 10 years or so. And this is really a no-nonsense case. Even though it was highly publicized, news media was in there. There was a lot of smexy talk and nude photos on display. It doesn't have a lot of the prosecutorial misconduct that we've been seeing in more recent cases.
Yeah, at least not up in the open. But we do know that the appeals court said that this trial was riddled with misconduct regarding surprise.
But the misconduct that the Court of Appeals went after this prosecutor with would be par for the course today. You know, no one was going to be appeal and say that that was misconduct. Dropping the camera in the middle of the courtroom to prove a point. It's not argumentative. It's not destroying evidence. It would have been just, that's what, he was making a point.
Yeah. Seeing what happens in trials today is, this is
trials today. We got experts throwing phones across their offices and testifying about it.
Yeah, and it's allowed in as evidence.
Yeah, but this prosecutor dropping a phone was considered, or a camera was considered misconduct.
Yeah.
High school level above, it's a standardized achievement test.
Okay. And how long do these tests normally take to give?
Depends on how many subscales or subtests are administered. It could be anywhere from 20 minutes to closer to an hour, depending on if you administer all and they keep going through it.
Okay. And the other test is, there's another test known as the WAIS. That's the Wechsler one, right?
Yes, the Wechsler is the adult intelligence scales. There's also various versions. It's in the 4th version. That's a measure of intellectual functioning. At least it gives you IQ scores in different arenas.
All right. And are you aware of whether or not Dr. DeMarte gave this test as well?
Yes.
And incidentally, were these tests both updated?
Yes.
The ones that she gave?
Yes.
Okay. And so do these tests provide any type of psychological diagnosis?
No.
Anything? So if Dr. DeMarte tells or says that the reasoning for giving this test was to provide any information regarding psychological diagnosis or state of mind at the time of the incident, or Ms. Arias' emotional functioning. If Dr. DeMarte were to say that, do these tests do that?
No, they do not. They are very specific in those particular areas, looking at, again, my language is cognitive functioning, the different skills, abilities a person has in the academic arena, their vocabulary, their verbal skills, their ability to put blocks and other things together. In my language, it's called spatial relations. They're very specific for those types of things. They are not psychological measures from the standpoint of anything we've been talking about today. They don't lead to diagnosis other than if the person has mental retardation, that would be a diagnosis that you could obtain partially from those tests. Or if they have a learning disability, you can get an idea from those tests whether they might, that you should explore further. But from a psychological standpoint, emotional, no, they're not connected.
Okay, so in this situation, prior to giving the MMPI too, would it have been appropriate for Dr. DeMarte to give these two tests, the RAT and the WAIS, in your opinion?
Based on the role you define, no, they wouldn't have provided any meaningful information that you could not get for the other tests by having the person talk to you or read the first paragraph of the MMPI to make sure they can read at the 5th grade level and understand it. That would take a couple of minutes. There's no other reason that those would be connected to trying to determine a diagnosis.
Okay. And are you familiar with other psychologists who have given these types of tests in situations where they're not needed?
Oh, yes.
And how does that happen?
Two ways. One of the things in graduate schools virtually all over this country is there's quite a bit of effort spent on training psychologists, including ours, on how to administer the adult intelligence scales and the achievement tests and others. especially if you're evaluating for competency or your disability or looking at kids for learning disabilities. So there's a lot of training. So most psychologists are trained on those tests. Because many psychologists are not trained on other tests or understand them, they use what they do know. So you see this happening over and over in cases we deal with regularly, where these are used and they're not meaningful in what we're looking at, because it makes it look like you've done a comprehensive battery. I've given all these tests. Well, these aren't relevant. So we see in cases we deal with where people administer that to say it's that. Also, it increases their hours and fees. But it's not meaningful. It's not relevant for what you're looking at.
And so in this particular case, was it meaningful or relevant at all, in your opinion?
That's correct. What the results?
Same. The noon recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you take an abbreviated lunch today, 1 hour and 15 minutes. So please be back at 1:20 and we will start promptly at that time. Please remember the admonition. You are excused.
And remember to subscribe to Vielheimer Media.
Vielheimer. Yeah, Vielheimer Media. In the description, he fixed all the audio for us on this, did a wonderful job. So you guys need to go subscribe to him. He's got a ton of trials. If you want to watch the trials without the commentary, which I don't know why you would, but if you want to, you can rewatch a ton of trials, everything from Zachariah Anderson to this case. He's got Casey Anthony. He's got some Sarah Boone stuff. He's got, does he have Sarah Boone? I can't remember. Anyways, he's got a ton of stuff. Go check him out. And I don't know if this is a good spot to end if we're going to keep going. But
I think this is a good cutoff point at 2:33:00. Easy to remember to next Saturday.
There we go. We're going to redirect you guys over to Legally Minded Friends with Karen Cole. This is a new person that I'm not sure about, but she's talking about the Netflix case.
Yeah.
And if you don't know about, what is it?
Baby Reindeer?
Baby Reindeer.
Stalker thing. And
and she's got a UK attorney with her right now, and that's what I want. I wanted to hear a UK attorney's take on this, so I'm going to jump over there for a bit and just listen in after this. So we're going to redirect you guys over there, and let her know we said hi, and I'll be in the chat a bit.
Yeah. So will I, actually, because I want to hear this. So we will be sending you all over there, and later today I am doing Serial Killer Saturday. It won't be Eileen Warren, so I will do an update on the Rex Hoyerman case, the Gilgo Beach murders. There's been 2 new victims accredited him. So he's charged with 2 new murders. So now they're up to 8. So I'll be going through that later today. And
and then at 7 p.m. Eastern, I have a stream with a couple of individuals, part of the legal team from Lynette and the What the Hales. Federal litigation. So we're going to be going through the federal lawsuit, breaking that down, as well as talking about some new stuff never before seen. So this will be fun.
Okay. See you later. Say hi from us to Legally Minded Friends Karen Cole. And have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.
Tried to claim Jodi was the culprit, she was the one to blame. But in this silly town,